Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Nicholson Baker?
Yes, Paul.
Nicholson, it's such a pleasure to have you on this call. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. Tell me, Nick, how have you been living these last 11 months of this delirious period? My guess is probably not so differently than the way you usually live.
That's exactly right. How am I living mentally? Obviously, it's different because people are dying and are sick, and the world is unhappy, with a new kind of unhappiness. So that's troubling. My own daily rhythms are. I'm a self-employed person, and I've been writing books and articles for a long time. So I basically write 7 days a week. And I write at home. And so my rhythm is that I like to, I'll tell you, I get up very early, sometimes 3:30 in the morning, and I do some writing, sometimes some drawing, and then I get sleepy and I go back to bed, and then I get up again. So I have 2 mornings every morning, which is nice. And then I talk to my wife. And that's my life, is basically talking to my wife, walking the dogs, and keeping up with what's happening in the world, in quotation marks.
Why in quotation marks?
Well, I mean that what one's world is, what my world is a small town in Maine where there's no evidence that there is a pandemic in progress because People walk their dogs. I wave at them. A bus drives by every so often. It's an orange bus. It's been driving by there since we moved here. And neighbors nod at each other. So there's no change. There's nothing. If you parachuted in to this town and you looked around, there would be no way you could tell that there was something going on. It's because people who are outdoors are far enough apart, they don't even wear masks usually, although we do now. I mean, come on. But no, there's no change. There's no change in my texture of my life, but there's a change in what I've been thinking about, and I've written about the disease, but it hasn't touched me except insofar as it changes, running errands at the supermarket and things.
It hasn't changed your quotidian, but what do you miss?
I miss the idea that although we are not really huge travelers, I miss the idea that the world is potentially visitable. That there would be, that we could sit around, like I often what I like to talk to my wife about is where we might go. Like, would it be good to go to New Zealand, or would it be good to go to Paris, for goodness sake, or take trains around Europe, and then there's always this kind of thing of, well, no, you can't do any of that. Not that we have the money or the time, and we also have 2 sort of fragile dogs, so we couldn't do that anyway. But I miss the sanity and the kind of routineness of the world in which the news is just is just something that happens far away, and it's very predictable. And the news has been way too present, and I'm the guy who doesn't keep up with the headlines at all. I'm very interested in the headlines from 1910 or from 1953. I love the sense that headlines give you of being able to travel back in time. But I have a problem with the headlines of right now because they're all those familiar names that we've read over and over again, and there's sort of a name fatigue that creeps in.
That's your form of traveling, the headlines from the past.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a very efficient form. I learned it back when I ended up being in charge of a large newspaper collection with my wife, and we would just open a volume and we would be suddenly transported to, 1898 in the Spanish-American War or something.
In preparing to speak to you, I revisited some of my very favorite essays of yours. One that I love because we spoke about it once upon a time, Discards, about what has happened, the fate of card catalogs in libraries. I have to say, Nick, it was such a pleasure to reread it. Truly, it gave me kind of a feeling of tactile inebriation simply by feeling what is lost when one loses the card catalog. And it reminded me so much of a story of Gershom Scholem, who was in a library somewhere in Eastern Europe, and a librarian was looking at him and seeing him go through the card catalog and asked him finally, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm looking for a book I haven't read." But it brought back all kinds of memories. And then I discovered an essay of yours, very short little essay, one could say an entry and a reflection. And I'm wondering if you have either returned to it or returned to the book you were writing about, which is Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, a little article you wrote in 2009. And I'm wondering, as you might reflect back on that article and truth-telling, how relevant it might be for the very moment we have now and our very troubling headlines.
Well, thank you for reading both of those things. The card catalog piece, it seems like a very, very long time ago now, but I think I still have the sense of loss. Not to say that online catalogs and being able to search for things isn't beautiful and wonderful, but just that those were documents created by very smart librarians that were sort of snapshot of the history of that particular library. And so I miss those big wooden machines, of course, those dinosaurs, woolly mammoths almost. As far as Daniel Defoe, I wrote that piece for the Columbia Journalism Review, and the idea was pick a journalist you admire and write about some classic of journalism. And I thought about it, and I'm not as wide a reader as many people. I'm underread. So I went back to what I think about is that Defoe was really one of the first journalists anyway, and he would write these pamphlets, and they were astonishing because they were filled with details of life that were unlike. They were really reporting. They have a very modern flavor, and yet they were sort of fraudulent. So the Journal of a Plague Year has a lot of truth in it, but it is based on a fake idea that it's narrated by someone who lived through the plague. And Defoe himself had an uncle who had lived through the plague and relatives who had, and he talked to people and he gathered all these interesting facts, but then he retold it in the first person as if he had lived through it and was recalling these things. And it's a harrowing document. It's fascinating because it catches the sense of the silent city and the sudden suddenly 3 screams come out from an upstairs window, and then everything falls silent again. It's just a very sort of shudderingly true, real thing, but based also on a fiction. So people were very disappointed when they realized that, and realized that it was not. Is it the first bit of creative nonfiction? Is it nonfiction? What is it? And so that's what I wanted to write about: is how true is it, and what does it mean to say that something is true,
or to say that something is fake? Because maybe in so many ways he captured something that a true document might not.
Well, because this is what he did repeatedly, is he put things in the first person. And the most famous thing is Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe was published as an autobiographical account, and there was no word anywhere on it that it was a novel. It was trying to be not a novel, and there's a Moll Flanders is the story, the self-told story of a woman who has a number of adventures. So that was his method. He himself was, what did he do? I think he sold roofing tiles or something. He was a
trader of sorts.
Yeah, and he was obviously tremendously curious about life, especially low, raffish life, and people who'd done things that were somewhat compromising and difficult. And so he was attracted to the gritty specificity, the textures of life in a way that nobody else was. And that's why he is, in a sense, the first novelist and the first journalist at the same time.
I mean, in many ways, I don't know if you would agree, but what you said about Defoe has some bearing on who Nicholson Baker is in some way.
Well, I mean, I'm a confused guy just stumbling through the planet, and
yeah, you might be that confused guy, but you are also that guy who, when an idea captures your imagination, and more importantly, when a subject does, you obsess about it nearly in a monomaniacal way, wanting to know every bit of information you possibly can about it. And just before the pandemic broke out, you finished the book, I believe, called Baseless, and I think the subtitle is so interesting: My Search for Secrets in the Ruins of the Freedom of Information Act. And when I read the word secret, I never, as you know, I'm a quotomaniac by profession. I couldn't stop thinking of Benjamin Franklin's wonderful line that for 2 people to keep a secret, one has to be dead. So I'm wondering if in some way Baseless prepared you for the pandemic.
It did and it didn't. It's a book. Yes, it's a book about about waiting for the government to cough up certain documents that I really felt were important in order to find out something that happened or didn't happen a very long time ago, in 1951, 1952. I had a question: was the United States involved in a very small-scale testing of biological weapons during the Korean War, as the Chinese and the North Koreans said that the United States was? And I wanted to know the answer. And other people have sort of washed up against these same rocks. And it's a very difficult, complicated question. And the reason it's complicated is not because it is because certain documents are still withheld by the Air Force, the CIA, the Navy, and so there's an incomplete record from the early 50s during a time in which the CIA found its footing. So I was learning about all these methods that the CIA used, called methods of messing with an enemy's head. That way where you do something and then deny you're doing something. That there was a whole method of doing that I think was employed in the Korean War. So I was writing about all that, but it's so different to think about something that happened a long time ago. I mean, this was before I was born. I was born in 1957. This all happened in the early 50s. And then I finished the book. I was actually putting the last endnotes in. I'd gotten an amazing sudden burst of documents right at the end from the National Archives. A completely unredacted document just appeared magically in the mail. It was kind of a crucial document from 1949 describing a cover and deception plan for biological warfare, that the United States would pretend to the Russians that we had developed this biological superweapon, and that would cause them to waste their energies in the biological warfare field. That was the plan, the Pentagon plan. And it was voted on and decided by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that this would happen. And this has been kept a secret until it just arrived in the mail. So I had all this happening in January, February, March, and also gradually this other thing is happening that is taking place in the present. And there are, for me, there were particular linkages. Not that what happened in 2020 was the result of a biological weapon. I really don't think it was. But what I wrote about in the book was laboratory accidents, because, the first people to die when you're developing a biological weapon or messing with dangerous germs in some way, the people who die or get sick when you study these diseases, first people are the scientists. And there were many laboratory accidents in the 50s, some fatal, in which people, they were trying to brew anthrax, and they wanted to brew a lot of it, and they had this foaming method of doing that. And the guy who was in charge of perfecting that method got anthrax and died. And his death was attributed to something else in the press release, but that's what happened. So there were laboratory accidents. That was in my mind. And then we have this disease that just starts to kind of germinate all over the world in this very unsettling way. It's very transmissible, which was the aim of American students of germ weapons back in the day. How do you make something that really just made chickens sick or pigs sick or humans sick a little bit? How do you make it so that it passes through the air? It's how do you make something aerosolized? Aerosols were crucial to the early Cold War American biological warfare scientists. And this was a huge program. This was a program that was given A1 priority by Harry Truman. It was the same priority as nuclear weapons, and very secretive. And aerosols were at the center of it. And here we are dealing with this new disease that is aerosolized. So that's what I had, was this sort of question mark, this puzzlement. And that's all I really had for a while.
But a question mark left to you more often than not, when it is irksome in this way, pushes you to try, as I was saying, to really investigate it slowly but persistently. And then you wrote this extraordinary piece, which I recently had occasion to read in New York Magazine, which was published nearly to the day a month ago, which is called "Did the Coronavirus Escape from a Lab?" And perhaps I have answered the question to some extent, but not really. Why did you write this piece?
Well, let's see how to answer that. Why? I mean, the piece practically killed me. It was very difficult to write.
I imagine.
Because it was too hard to write it, because we don't know enough, and there's been no investigation, and there's been because when people are still dying of something, if there's a war on, or if there's some sort of plague happening, people don't think rationally. And there's just a tremendous amount of emotion about all this, and it was hyper-politicized and all that. What happened really, let me travel back to, so there's that moment where I have a question mark that I know a lot about lab accidents in the Cold War from a long time ago, and then here we have a new disease, and all I know is that in the city of Wuhan, a massive, huge city, a brand new laboratory recently opened and is a BSL 4, biological safety level 4 laboratory. That didn't interest me that much because I thought, well, I mean, it's a big world and lots of complicated things, and there, 11, 12 million people, 13, I don't know, a lot of people living in that city, and I didn't know anything about it. What caught my mind, though, was an article in Newsweek by Fred Gutterl, who wrote about the fact that the National Institutes of Health, the United States' premier health funding agency, paid the Wuhan laboratory to do certain experiments with bat viruses and human viruses. And these experiments, some of them were classed in a special way, and they were called gain-of-function experiments because they were attempting to increase the transmissibility or infectiousness of a bat disease and show that it could potentially infect humans. And that was just a revelation that the United States was paying countries, not just China, but a number of countries, to do this kind of research around the world, and that the research was very, very closely related to the actual organism that is at the center of this pandemic. So that got me started. And then, of course, at my published Baseless, I did some publicity for the book, and people would say, and what about the pandemic? What are your feelings about it? And so I basically had to come up with what my feelings were. And my feelings were complicated because actually the book is about the fact that the Chinese were the victims of an American experiment. And I think there's a certain amount of evidence that that's true. So in this case, what's happened is that this disease, which was first called the Wuhan seafood market virus, I think it was called, by Chinese scientists, as that was what it was published, what it was called when it was uploaded to GenBank, the database of viruses. So it was given the name Wuhan seafood market virus at the very beginning of its life as a scientific studyable object. And yet it was sort of taboo to say, well, gee, I mean, what else is in Wuhan? And do bats live in Wuhan? No. Is it in the middle of winter? Do bats fly around? No. The bat caves are, 1,000 miles away. So what is going on? And it turns out that there was a very active discussion about all this, and a lot of it was happening on Twitter. So I just began reading virology papers, and I learned about the American efforts to come up to prove how infectious a disease might become, a disease of bats or a disease of other creatures might become, and in order to look ahead, there was sort of a preventive medicine. The NIH's idea was pay for research to show what the threats might potentially be zoonotically that would come out of nature. But in order to do that, you have to simulate that in a laboratory. So you build a new disease in a laboratory that is potentially a disease that might evolve naturally. And then, I just think, what do you say to that? You say, well, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, this is a potentially very dangerous way of operating. And it turned out that I was certainly not the first person to say that in the past, since 2012, there's been a very active debate in the scientific community about these particular kinds of experiments, euphemistically called gain-of-function experiments. And there were more than 100 American and international scientists who published a statement saying these experiments in which you attempt to make new diseases in the laboratory are very dangerous, and they have PPP, possible pandemic potential. Anyway, there are 3 P's involved somehow. Potential pandemic pathogens. So that's what they were worried about. Not all experiments with viruses, because obviously we want to understand these fascinating, amazing, adaptable, features of the living landscape. But a tiny percentage of virus experiments are experiments in which you try to increase the infectivity of something in a way that would create new risk. And the scientists were saying, basically, don't do that. And the NIH said, well, we'll have a pause. And they paused the funding for these experiments. The NIH is the biggest funder around, so it's terribly important. All scientists have to think about the NIH. So they paused it, except for some experiments that were happening in North Carolina in the laboratory run by Ralph Barrick, who is the premier coronavirologist. And the confusing thing is Barrick was collaborating with Shi Zhongli, who is the most well-known coronavirologist in China, who is in charge of one unit of the Wuhan Virology Lab. So there's this thing going on here, and we have to get to the bottom of it. And we haven't begun to get to the bottom of it.
And why this reluctance to find out? I mean, on one program of the Quarantine Tapes, I brought up the idea of gain-of-function research, and there was really a reluctance to talk about it. And we know so little about the origins of this disease. Why? I mean, in your piece, you have this wonderful line where you say, certainty craves detail and detail requires investigation. Why not go in that direction? Why not delve?
Well, why not indeed? I think that if an accident happened in an American laboratory, there would be a certain set of steps are required, a certain kind of investigation. Although I have to say that just based on my own research, there have been plenty of cover-ups of disastrous things that have happened in American laboratories that only come out several years after the fact, or people who run laboratories quite understandably don't want news of accidents to happen, but accidents do happen because scientists are people. The reason it's become taboo to talk about this is so simple, really. It's because, Donald Trump, who is obviously a deeply objectionable, horrific person, and Mike Pompeo and Steve Bannon and all that crew of people who we are mercifully escaping from the clutches of now, would go on TV saying, we happen to know that this is a Wuhan virus and it's a laboratory virus. And essentially, the thinking is anything that Donald Trump says is we must believe the opposite. I mean, it's this primitive. I'm sorry, but it's that primitive, and it is, and that's well founded because most of what Donald Trump said was total lies. But if Donald Trump says an escalator takes you up a flight of stairs, or that the sky is blue, or that buses, tend to carry some number of passengers or something. There are a number of things that I and everyone on this planet and Donald Trump can agree on. We stipulate certain things. And one of the things that we should all have in common is that scientists are human beings, and that sometimes when you are doing something with a very infectious organism, something can go wrong, especially if you are deliberately cranking up the dial on that organism. If you're deliberately doing things to it in a gene splicing kind of way that would make it more infectious, which is what the labs in the United States and the labs in China were engaged in doing in the latter years of 2018, 2019, and both in the United States and in China. So the fact that Trump was claiming this was terribly damaging to the quest for truth, because, obviously, Fauci is science and Trump is anti-science. And we have this tremendous polarization. And Fauci is funding gain-of-function research, and Trump is saying that this came in a laboratory and that they should stop funding this research. So what are you going to do if you're just in a sort of an onlooker in that? You have one person who is a egomaniacal, homicidal, racist horror show of a human being, and another guy who's been a scientist, basically has embraced the idea that there are ways of talking reasonably and scientifically about the world, and though he has made mistakes, is a decent guy, So what are you going to do? And so people obviously went and basically squelched any of these vibrations of doubt in their mind. And I think basically a lot of people thought, in fact, one scientist said this to me, even if it's true that it came from a laboratory in Wuhan, I don't want it, she said, I don't want it to be known, because it would create such racism and such hatred and such divisiveness that I want it to be thought to be a zoonotic occurrence for that reason. That the reason that we need to keep a lid on these hatreds and these antipathies. And I understand that. I mean, that's a very valid thing to say. I have a different view of it, which is that if you pretend that something is a certain way, you create a vacuum, you create a void, and you suck in all kinds of absurd, insane theories, which is what we're swimming in right now. All kinds of theories of, reptiles that live under the Antarctic landmass and drink blood and commandeer Pizza Huts or pizza places. I mean, just all kinds of insane stuff. Go searching for paranoid reasons to be if the truths aren't clearly laid out. If somebody's holding something back, and then there's a vacuum created, then other things creep in. So my feeling is, in order for science to work, you have to let it work. You have to investigate. You have to find out. You have to talk to people. Look at notebooks. Ask people all around the world, not just in Wuhan, but what were you doing with bad viruses that would potentially make them more infectious, since a bad virus is the nearest known relative to this virus that's now killing people. Let's just go around to all the laboratories on the planet, not singling out China, and find out what is the context, the community of science, and the kind of interrelated nexus of understanding that might potentially have led to a dangerous situation.
When will that story be written?
Well, it may never be written, because there's so much active veiling of and closing off of avenues of inquiry. So it may never be known. It may be like these, I find just tremendously annoying things that, like UFOs and the Kennedy assassination, that then, books are written. I want to save people from 1,000 books on the sources of the Wuhan, the sources of the worldwide pandemic, because we saw those little things that people say. So and so told me, and just before he died, so and so had some papers, and then they were destroyed, and all that stuff. Don't want that. What we want is clear, absolute, inarguable with truth, in which somebody says, yeah, I had a flask in my hand, it fell, and when I was, something happened. Or it wasn't in my lab, but what Xi Zhongli says, I swear on my life, this is the woman in China, that it didn't happen in my lab. Okay. She says that people who say these irresponsible things should shut their stinking mouths, is the other thing she said. But she didn't say it didn't happen in any lab. She just said it didn't happen in her laboratory. And I mean, I think there's something useful there to think about. There were something like 4 virology laboratories in Wuhan, and one of them was very close to the seafood market, so people who might have had an asymptomatic infection might have gone shopping for lunch. It doesn't have to be that there was an exotic animal for sale at the Wuhan market. That doesn't seem to be the source of it. But there's an investigation going on right now, Paul, and what is truly bizarre and I think shocking about it is one of the investigators is this man, Peter Daszak, who has been the primary conduit for American scientific money. The money has gone through his New York City foundation and gone from there to laboratories in various places as he hires people to do bat virus sampling and also experimental work. So he is the pipeline through which money from the NIH and from the Pentagon, from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, went through him to places, to recipients, including Xi Zhongli herself in Wuhan. They worked together for years. And so fine. Maybe that's all good, and maybe that was the right thing to do. But don't put him in the party of people who are looking into the sources, the origins of the pandemic. But he is on 2 committees. He's on the Lancet Committee of the Origins of the Pandemic, and he's on the World Health Organization's committee. And the World Health Organization's committee is in Wuhan now, knocking on the door of the Wuhan laboratory. And here's the guy who is most concerned to cover up any possibility. He's the one who engineered a whole statement in the Lancet saying that any statement any contention that the virus originated in a laboratory is a, quote, conspiracy theory. And that is just such a destructive and such a completely untrue, unscientific way of looking at it. Of course, it's not a conspiracy theory to say that it could have come from a laboratory. It's actually the opposite of a conspiracy theory. You're saying somebody made a mistake. Somebody had an accident.
Somebody was clumsy.
Somebody was clumsy. Is that a conspiracy? It's not 3 guys sitting around saying, we're going to be clumsy today. No, it just things happen. People screw up sometimes. But also lab animals are very unhappy about being inoculated with exotic diseases. And they have teeth and they bite, and they sometimes bite through 2 layers of blue gloves. I mean, it just happens. This is what happens. So there could have been some accident like that. We just need to know that a thorough investigation has happened. It should have happened 1 year ago. Immediately, as soon as Xi Zhongli said to the Scientific American reporter, she said, I couldn't sleep a wink. I thought, did it come from my laboratory? That was her first thought when she heard about this new disease. Well, if this scientist thinks it could have come from a laboratory, that's very revealing, because that means that it's the kind of disease that she was working with. So as soon as she said that, there should have been a massive investigation of her laboratory and the other laboratories she cooperated with internationally and also in China. But that did not happen.
But no, it didn't happen. It didn't happen, and I think you're addressing some of the reasons why it may not have happened. And when I asked you a bit earlier, will this story be written? Your answer was, it may never be written. Hearing you talk about this, Nicholson, I can only understand better why you're happy that the piece is published.
Well, I wanted to put it behind me. I mean, the thing is that being the bearer of news that makes people very unhappy, and also I don't like when people get mad at me and say that I'm a conspiracy theorist, or say that I'm saying things that are against China. I love China. None of that is good. So finishing something like that is a huge relief, because really, is it what life is about? Is muckraking and coming up with all the dark, unhappy things about life? Of course not. The real task of an artist is to say, here is this incredible smorgasbord of beautiful, strange, funny, odd things, and here's what we can say that is makes life feel worth living. And I would like to be the bearer of good news, so it's a very uncomfortable position to sometimes feel compelled, and I felt compelled partly because a very nice editor from New York Magazine called up and said, would you like to write the piece? I felt compelled to write the piece. I was already reading about the piece. I was already caught up in it. And then here they are saying, would you like to write 6,000 words? Well, okay. And I ended up writing 15,000 words, which then got cut down. That's the way it happens, that's what happens. But it's over now. And I'm back to thinking, I hope I'm back to thinking about, the different sounds that snow makes when it's on a cold day and things like that.
Well, yes, and I was going to ask you about that. Now that you have freed yourself of this piece and of deciding a piece that is not perhaps what makes you happiest, I'm wondering if you're going back to either writing fiction or other kinds of essays, and perhaps even importantly, what you might be reading.
My self-assignment is I'd like to write a short story. I've written, 17 books now. I used to write short stories, and I forgot how. I realized I not only forgot how to write short stories, I forgot how to read short stories, and I love them. And so I've been reading. I told myself that I'd read a short story a day, and it hasn't been happening, which is a source of some guilt. But there's stories by people like Alice Adams and Robert Coates and of course John Cheever and others. But and a story does something miraculous in a short space of time, and it's just a whole different set of energies, of a whole different set of force fields, and it happens quickly. And I need to relearn how to read short stories. So I've been reading stories to myself, and just listening to how they sound, and hoping that somewhere along the way I'll remember how to write one.
Is reading a short story different than reading a novel?
Well, it is, because reading a novel, the bathtub is not a bathtub. It's not even a hot tub. It's the Mediterranean. It's huge. You're suddenly splashing around it, and there are all kinds of strange seaweeds, and you never know where you're going to go. Whereas a short story, you've got the rubber ducky. That's it. You've got the faucets and the bath and the warm water, and you're there, and you know what you're dealing with usually. And I've always liked reading poems, and I learned to write by reading poetry. And so a short story is just sort of a poem that has cracked a little, and certain things have seeped out and then re-solidified in a slightly larger receptacle or something. So I feel I have a chance of understanding short stories the way I understand poems. I read a lot of poems, but I have trouble sometimes reading novels because of certain, I think basically certain failures of personality that I get. When I get involved in a novel that's too tense, and I want to know what happened, it becomes physically uncomfortable. I have to stop and pace around and things. I've got a problem with plot that is not that I can't do it, which is of course true. I'm not very good at plot, but also doing it. But I also experiencing it makes me keyed up. But a short story has a kind of a different way of approaching that. Sometimes they're fascinating plots, but they are told a different way, and they open up a different way. So I'm just looking forward to seeing if I can write if I can go back to writing in a form that I started with. About 40 years ago, my first story was accepted by the New Yorker. It was called Snorkeling for some reason. Or no, I think it wasn't. I think in the end it was called Pants on Fire. It was one of those absurdist titles. I like to do that. Barthelme did that. But it was about a guy who could charge sleep, and he had other people do his sleeping for him, and yet he developed a tremendous sleep debt. So then he had to become a sleeper, and sleep for other people. And it was a very New York it was early '80s. It was 1981, I think. So it was just when New York was revving up, and it was fun to write it. I remember sitting at a table just thinking, that's a thought. I could just write a story about a guy who could charge sleep, and did it.
What might a short story look like now? Not the plot, but what is so wonderful about hearing you say this is by talking about that table, I feel as if, Nick, you are there, and in a sense, that's where you want to be. Even if you're in Maine, you're back. It's kind of a desire for being younger again.
Yes. Oh, I would love to start all over and do it right this time and figure it out and understand where I'm going. What a story would look like now, I think. There are just so many interesting faces in the world. People are so different. And in the political realm, there's been this crunching down of differences so that, you're either on one side or another. But in reality, and I know this from drawing, I do a fair amount of drawing of people's faces, how different faces are, how different people's pasts are, and how they explain themselves is so different than the way television deals with the texture of their lives, or the way I just think that there's a way to talk about human life that hasn't been tried yet. Now maybe it's just that I tried it and failed, or maybe it's done and I haven't read the person who's done it, but I still think that there's something left to be done with words. Or I wouldn't be doing it, I guess. But I feel there's more to be done. That life is still got a lot of joyous confusion in it that needs to be combed through.
Nick, what a pleasure it's been to speak to you. Really, really, really. And I hope when we can travel again for real, while we travel in an imaginary way, I will get to see you again. It's really such a pleasure to hear your voice and to talk to you today.
Thank you, Paul. It's a great pleasure, and we go way back.
We do. All the best to you. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
And
Take care.
And read many short stories.
I'll try.
And write a few.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.